the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, humans are made of meat, but animated by chocolate dipped in wishful thinking, which stretches in 5 dimensions, including time. Confederate hosts in Pennsylvania as Lincoln Monument comes to life and stomps on descendant of John Wilkes Booth. Plus, we continue with our complete audiobook serialization of Alliance of Equals by Sharon Lee and Steve Miller, all right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour podcast. It's an honor to have you along. I'm Baen editor Tony Daniel. We have an interview with J.R. Dunn talking about his alternate history collaboration with the late Robert Conroy. The book is called The Day After Gettysburg. This is a very cool examination of what might have happened had Lee turned around and struck back after the Battle of Gettysburg, instead of crossing over the Potomac, heading south and into history. The book has all kinds of great characters expertly drawn by Conroy and military historian Jeff Dunn. Jeff will discuss what it was like to complete Robert Conroy's novel after Bob Conroy's untimely passing. Plus, we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Liaden Universe novel Alliance of Equals by Sharon Lee and Steve Miller. Now here's the news. Well, mass markets are fanning out over the June landscape even as we speak. At booksellers everywhere is Black Tide Rising, edited by John Ringo and Gary Poole. This is an excellent collection of top-notch stories set in John Ringo's Black Tide Rising zombie apocalyptic universe. The news that humanity has been dreading has come true. Zombies are real. Worst of all, we created them. The apocalypse is upon us, and every man, woman, and child has to answer a simple question of themselves. What do we do now? Answering that question are writers Eric Flint, Sarah Hoyt, Jody Lynn Nye, Michael Z. Williamson, Casey Azell, Mike Massa, and many more. And John Ringo, of course, also has a great story in the collection. Also at booksellers in June is the mass market edition of 1636, The Chronicles of Dr. Gribbleflots by Karen Offord and Rick Boatwright. This one is a sparkling addition to the Ring of Fire alternate history series created by Eric Flint. An alchemist of the 17th century confronts modern science with often amusing results. In his relentless search for ways to invigorate the quinta essentia of the human humors, Gribbleflots plays a central role in jump-starting the 17th century new chemical and marital aids industries and pioneering critical fields of human knowledge, also pyramidology and aural imaging. These are his chronicles. Black Tide Rising, edited by John Ringo and Gary Poole, and 1636, The Chronicles of Dr. Gribbleflots by Karen Offord and Rick Boatwright. Mass market editions are now at booksellers everywhere. I want to welcome J.R. Dunn to the podcast. Hey, Jeff.
Hey.
J.R. Dunn is a novelist, editor, and political commentator, active both in print and online. He's a consulting editor at The American Thinker, writing on military affairs, contemporary politics, conservative political theory, and liberal scandals and misbehavior. He has also written several essays for Baen.com on the future of the military and the military of the future. His columns have been reprinted, linked to, discussed in publications as varied as Real Clear Politics, The New York Times, USA Today, The Daily Telegraph, and Investors Business Daily. Jeff is the author of nonfiction book Death by Liberalism, The Fatal Outcome of Well-Meaning Liberal Policies. He is also the author of 3 science fiction novels. His books include This Side of Judgment, Full Tide of Night, and Days of Cain, widely hailed, especially by me, as one of the best science fiction time-traveling novels, and perhaps the best SF examination of the Holocaust, of which there are many. It's practically a genre. He served as associate editor of the International Military Encyclopedia, which has been on hiatus since his departure, so obviously he had a lot to do with that thing going on. In addition, Jeff is one of our go-to copy editors here at Baen. From, I think it was 1920, America's Great War, onward, he has been the copy editor for all of Robert Conroy's alternate history novels. When Bob Conroy died of cancer unexpectedly, I think it was December 2014, we had a couple of books of Bob's already in, And we also found out there's this partially finished Conroy manuscript out there. After looking at it, we saw that Bob had written a big chunk of it. We'll talk more about that, of this alternate Civil War novel. After getting permission and encouragement from Bob's widow, Diane, and daughter, Mara, we asked Jeff Dunn to finish the book as co-author. He came up with a plan for doing so, which Tony and I thought very highly of. And now at booksellers everywhere is The Day After Gettysburg by Robert Conroy and J.R. Dunn. Let's go back to the start of this. What did you think when you first read Bob Conroy's unfinished manuscript? How did you plan to complete it?
Well, I was really impressed by the work he'd done. It was a really solid piece of work. I mean, it wasn't just an outline and a couple of chapters. He'd really gotten deeply into it. So any indecision I had about it just disappeared. I knew I could handle it from the basis that he created. Okay.
Yeah.
And the thing is now Bob did not do outlines, which is kind of frustrating because I didn't really know for sure where it was headed. But he left enough clues in there, so I had a solid picture of where the book was going. And it just from that point out, it just kind of unrolled itself. I had no problem writing the thing whatsoever. It wasn't really a challenge.
Do you remember how many? You had about 50,000 words or so written, something like that.
Yeah, but more or less, it was somewhere between a half and 2/3. So it was substantial. I mean, a couple of the scenes were placeholders.
Yeah.
Where he'd obviously written out the scene just as in basic form to come in and replace later on. But there wasn't a whole lot of that.
I remember talking to Bob he asked me what to write next at one point, and I said, man, do a Civil War and alternate history. I love those things. So can you explain the basics? And he took me up on it. So can you explain the basics of the historical situation you and Bob were building from? This is at the high tide of the war for the southern side, that is, when Lee has crossed into Pennsylvania. He's fought this little battle near Gettysburg. Where are we in the war in real time?
Minor skirmish.
Yeah.
Vaguely known to most people.
Mm. That's all too true sometimes these days, unfortunately.
Yeah. Come to think of it.
Was that Vietnam? I don't know.
Smart thing to say.
Yeah.
But basically it's the hinge moment comes right after Gettysburg. Now in the real world, Lincoln was encouraging Meade to go after Lee, try to intercept him before he got across the Potomac, and wipe out the army in Northern Virginia, which Lincoln would hope would wrap up the war. But as we know, the Union Army, the Army of the Potomac, had been utterly mauled at Gettysburg, and wasn't in enough shape to chase a bunch of puppies.
In real life, what happens? Lee crosses the Potomac.
Yeah, that was in real life. Lee crossed the Potomac and got away because Meade was smart enough not to go after him. Now, in day after Gettysburg land, Meade goes after Lee, and Lee, as he was incredibly skilled at doing, he was magnificent in defense, turned around and beat the living tar out of Meade. Yeah. But at that point, he decides to step back into Pennsylvania and effectively occupy the center of the state in order to create a kind of situation where Meade will have to batter himself against the army of Northern Virginia in order to get any place, and also in order to support efforts by Jefferson Davis's government to obtain assistance from the UK, from Great Britain.
Yeah, and
that's the situation as it stands.
Yeah, and that's the great hope. One of the great hopes of the South is bringing England in on the southern side and saying, "Why don't you just end this war now?"
All the way through the war.
Yeah.
Yeah, all the way through the war. That was what they were banking on. And of course, it couldn't happen because the war obviously was not really going in their favor. And because the British had the good sense not to step into a battle that really would have gained them nothing.
Yeah, it was a forlorn hope. The South was Full of forlorn hopes.
That's it, the forlorn hope.
All right. First of all, there was a thing that made Lee decide he couldn't cross, which was just a different thing that happened, which was what, a tidal. The Potomac's a tidal river, right? So it rose. It was too high to cross, in other words. So that sort of encouraged Lee to make his move and strike back, turn around and strike back.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then they go to, where is it? Harrisburg's going to be our main center of the Confederate occupation of Pennsylvania, right?
He kind of bounces around from town to town, but Harrisburg is the obvious center because it's the largest town in the area, most easily defensible, on a river and so forth.
Yeah,
So
and
Harrisburg ends up being the center.
And Lee's thought is that Meade is very good at defense, but not good at attacking. Is that the?
Yeah, which is true.
So he's turned the tables on him in that way.
Yeah, Meade. Well, as we can see at Gettysburg, the Gettysburg victory for the Union was basically a defensive victory. He sat there on the ridge and just let the army of Northern Virginia batter itself against him until there was absolutely no hope whatsoever, and then turn around and head south.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't an attacker like Grant or Sherman or the others, but he was great at what he did. And the point is, Lee could sit there in Pennsylvania without any real doubts about the fact that Meade couldn't take him on, particularly since the Union Army at the time was overpopulated with political generals and various incompetents, Ben Butler, people like that, who couldn't or wouldn't take orders and were incapable of carrying out a campaign. So Lee could sit up there for a while anyway, in the middle of enemy territory, and defy the North without any particular worries about the end game. That is, until a real wild man, a real attacker, a real mad dog comes up unexpectedly in the form of U.S. Grant. Vicksburg victory came. Yeah, that came the same week as like the next day after the Gettysburg battle, July 4th, as a matter of fact. So he conquered the Mississippi Valley. That was under control, and he was basically at loose ends from that point. So he could, in fact, have been brought out to take over the Army of the Potomac. Except that the Halleck hated his guts, and everybody in the East Coast thought he was an alcoholic. He was a drunk.
Yeah.
Everybody out west in the Mississippi knew better because he wasn't really an alcoholic in the classic sense. He was a binge drinker. He drank under stress. And his assistant, his aide, Rawlinson, was aware of this and was able to more or less control the situation, so he never got that stressed out. Rawlinson handled it.
Yeah.
Or he could get the grant, and that was why he was able to continue steadily through the rest of the war.
Yeah. That was. I mean, bringing Mrs. Grant in always calmed him down. I think I remember reading.
That's another point.
So, all right. So Lincoln's in Washington. He's fairly distressed now that Lee's sitting in Pennsylvania. What is Abe thinking at this point, and what's the state of affairs on the Union side?
Well, basically, Abe's thinking exactly what he's thinking through the rest of the war. How do I get out of this? He'd been dealing with incompetent, inept, and incapable generals, particularly McClellan, for several years. People who could not or would not carry out any kind of plan that would lead to victory. And he was completely stymied. Meade was a competent general, but he wasn't an attacker. So what was he going to do? He had virtually no alternatives. The only alternatives he had is this drunken wild man from out west,
who his the chief of staff of the army hates.
Halleck.
Yeah.
Halleck hated his guts. Yeah. Then Halleck later on grew to respect Grant and see where he'd been mistaken. But at this point in the war, they were at daggers points.
Yeah.
They really hated each other. But so Lincoln was stymied. It's exactly the same he was in the first couple of years of the war. He was stymied. He had no place to turn. He knew that the strategy existed that would beat the South. He knew that the North had the power and had the forces to do it, but he just couldn't get it together.
So, and it takes a while to get it together in the novel as well, which is part of the fun of the novel. there is, so let's talk about some of the characters and subplots of the book. First, there is the main viewpoint, one of the main viewpoint characters, Major Steve Thorin. Tell us about him.
Right. Well, Thorin is basically a volunteer. He's a civilian from out in Indiana. He's taken over command of his cavalry unit after his commander, Colonel Baird, has been badly wounded. He's lost a leg. And he's new at this, but he's very capable of it. At the same time, he's not really suited to be a commander because he's way too sensitive. When somebody's killed in a battle, it really affects him badly. So he's kind of facing a serious dichotomy here, a serious emotional challenge in which he's doing something he's good at and he's doing something he likes to do, but he's doing something that'll destroy him too. And as a further subplot, he gets involved with his former commander's very feisty and very tough and no-nonsense daughter, which was pointed out in I think of the Review and Publishers Weekly. This is a typical thing in one of Bob's novels.
Yeah. She also supplies him with some reason for living and a backstop and some backbone as well.
Yeah, important. That's an important point. This is what female characters often do in Bob Conroy's novels. They're the ones who take the crucial role at the crucial point in making sure things are done right. He wrote extremely strong female characters, at the same time kind of conventional female characters, the character that acts in support of the male. So in a way he was a traditionalist, but he certainly had respect for women too, and that definitely comes out in the book. That's something that I wanted to make sure that I kind of lived up to the example he made there.
Yeah,
particularly with this character, Cassandra Baird, who's a very tough little girl.
Yeah, and she shows it in the course of the book. She is she's an abolitionist who is willing to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. Tell us about
put herself on the line. Yeah.
Tell us about what she does and a little more about her as well.
Well, she more or less adopts a group of runaway slaves, which is led by a very very tough figure named Hadrian. It's she in a way she's kind of playing the white redeemer woman, which has been a very common role in American literature, having to do with relations of blacks and whites for well over a century. But the point here is that it was real. This is the role that a lot of people did take at the time in rescuing slaves. So you can't put this down as being some white superiority thing. I wouldn't anyway. But she adopts this group and really lays herself on the line because, of course, people, the Copperheads and the Southern loyalists are after them, want to wipe them out. In the end, working with Hadrian, who's a totally independent figure. He's not any sort of Uncle Tom of any sort whatsoever. She manages not only to save them, but to carry out an act that completely turns around the progress of the war.
Yeah, and the fact that she
that'll read the book.
She gets Hadrian's respect. Hadrian is not only a tough guy; he's also really really smart, and he is the leader of this group.
Yeah.
He's got it organized, and without his support, nothing's going to happen. Cassandra is going to have to get him on her side, and it takes her a little while, but she does. On the southern side, we have an officer, Corey. It's Corey Wade, right? Colonel
Corey Wade, yeah.
Yeah. Tell us about Colonel Wade. He's a sympathetic character in his way.
Yeah, he is because let's face it, most of the Southerners were not Simon Legree slaveholders. Most of them were fighting for a legitimate cause as they understood it. It's like Robert E. Lee was not fighting for the Confederacy. He was not fighting for slavery, as a lot of PC types are claiming today. He was fighting basically for the state of Virginia. Back in the day, it was loyalties were a lot more localized than they are today. People thought more of themselves as being, I am a Virginian, I am an Ohioan, more than they thought of as the United States. The United States was still kind of formless in a way. It hadn't achieved maturity. So people kind of thought of it in a way that they would in a medieval era. That was kind of a survival, and that's the way it is with Corey Wade. He's not a bad guy. He's kind of a cliche in that he's a little bit too motivated by adolescent ideas of honor and military glory and so forth, much more than Steve Thorin is.
Yeah, and he's also kind of blind to the nastiness of some of his men, like the execrable Blanton. Blanton's a nasty piece of work. Tell us a little bit about, and he does some very, very horrible things in the book.
Indeed, he does.
Tell us about that side of the war and what he's trying to do. He's a opportunist for sure.
Yeah, well, in straightforward words, he's a scumbag. He's not a psychopath. He's not unemotional about it. He really gets excited by sadism, by tormenting people, and by bullying. That's his thing. And this is something that you had a lot more of in the frontier era, because they had a lot more they had a lot more grounds for getting away with it. You didn't have a fully developed legal system. You didn't have law and so forth, and people could run around and get away with stuff that they just can't get away with today. And this is what he's doing, particularly since he's down in the South and he can get away with brutalizing slaves and so forth that you couldn't do in the North, you couldn't do in other areas. Okay, so that's where he comes from, and we know he has quite a history of this. And we know that he's going to brutalize as many people as he can and really go over the top eventually. And that's where a lot of the tension comes in with Blanton. As far as his relationships with Wade, he can sense that Wade is a little bit weak, that he's a little bit of an adolescent, that his ideas are blinding him to certain things, including exactly how bad Blanton is. So he's able to manipulate Wade in order to get away with stuff and have Wade very reluctantly, against his own will, have Wade cover for him to a certain extent. Which is where it's the way things often are in real life with these types. You see it all the time. They kind of manipulate the boss, the president or whoever it is, and get them to cover for him because he's really not a bad guy. He's this, that, and another thing, and basically, when you get down to it, they couldn't get away with the stuff if they didn't have the cooperation of the people in charge. And this is what Blanton is real good at. In his own way, he's a complex character. He's not your simple-minded menace or bad guy or anything like that. He's a complex character, but he definitely does not understand himself. He's got a very low cunning, but he's really not. He's smart, but he's really not that smart.
Yeah, he thinks he's got it all figured out in the classic sense of
he does.
the criminal.
That's a good way to put it. He thinks he's got it all figured out, but he doesn't quite have everything figured out.
Yeah. And as we mentioned, Hadrian, he's a particularly great character. He's a born leader, determined not to let this band of freed slaves be sent back. And he also is smart and he figures out Cassandra is good. Tell us more, and in the end, he does some heroic stuff that's really fun with the plot to kill Lincoln. But we won't get all into that. But tell us a little bit about Hadrian.
Yeah, well, the thing with Hadrian, of course, is he's an alpha male. He's just the absolute leader. As Barrett says later in the book, the world would be spread before him at his feet if he were white. And that's absolutely the case. But the thing is, he comes from a limited background. He was raised as a slave. He's developed a totally cynical attitude toward the world at large, and particularly involving whites. White people are out to manipulate blacks. They're out to use them and so forth, and that is it. So it takes him a while to get it through his head that Cassandra is actually on his side and is not playing some kind of role.
And she's
and
also
in particular
competent. She is teaching people to read.
But then his real moment of awakening comes at the ultimate point where he suddenly realizes that he in fact is of value to whites. This is during the plot to kill Lincoln, when he makes the absolutely, I don't want to get into it in detail and ruin it for anybody, but when he makes the absolute correct move, encouraged by Cassandra.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about Booth. And
Booth?
What was going on? Yeah, I mean, unless you have more to say about Hadrian here.
Yeah, I think we can move on to Booth.
you obviously know a lot about Booth. I mean, this pretty much reflects how the guy really was.
I think so. He was, totally vain. He's probably a lot closer to being a pure psycho in the sense that we understand it than Blanton. Totally vain, totally self-centered, a complete narcissist, and very much a romantic in the 19th century sense. That willing to throw himself into causes that he really has nothing to do with.
Yeah. And he was pretty famous.
Well. Yeah, at the time, a lot of people hear about Booth and don't understand the fact that the family was the leading theatrical family of the time, and he, in his way, was the Tom Cruise of the era. He had people looking up to him. They used to sell lithographs of him in various roles and so forth and so on. The people would put framed on their walls. Yeah. There he is, John Wilkes Booth, the great thespian, as they would put it at the time.
I guess his brother was even more famous than him at the time.
Yeah, Edwin. I think the third one was Julian. Edwin was an even more talented actor, and of course he was sane, which is all usually a benefit.
Helps, yeah.
But there was also Julian, who was a theater owner. He did some acting, but he wasn't anywhere near as good as the other two. But he owned a chain of theaters.
So Booth.
So it was an entire theatrical family.
Booth gets together with a guy that Cassandra
Richard Dean, yeah,
had some dealings with before, and they decide that a kidnapping plot is the way to go. Could this have worked? I mean, obviously the assassination did work.
Yeah, the assassination worked, but that was there's so many weird things about that assassination. I mean, Lincoln's premonitions, his dreams, and so forth and so on, and the fact that his bodyguard just wasn't there. His bodyguard just wandered off for some reason, and so forth, and the officer he was with, I forget the officer's name, but it was the officer and his fiancée. And about 20 years later, the officer went mad and killed his wife, who was the same girl that survived the assassination. It's just such a weird scene. It almost seems like fate, you know. It almost seems like it was planned out from the beginning of time that Lincoln would fulfill his task, he would do his job, and then he would die.
Yeah. Boy, that sounds like a
illogical in that sense.
Time travel novel from you at some point.
Yeah. Yeah. It's well, the one figure you really want to save is Lincoln, because if he lived, everything would have been different. If he lived, the Reconstruction would not have been as harsh and brutal as it was. Something would have been done for the ex-slaves. That we would have had. Sherman's concept of 40 acres and a mule, get them out of the South where they're hated, and there's no role for them. Get them someplace else. Get them on the frontier or something like that, where they can build new lives and so forth and so on. This is something that just didn't happen in our world, and it's probably the great failure in the aftermath of the Civil War. I mean, let's face it, the Civil War just raises hatreds and bitterness that is totally different from any other kind of warfare. So,
yeah, and
any different than it was.
Resonated. Yeah. So, I mean, even today, geez Louise, we're having people taking down monuments from this long past war. That
the South is always the scapegoat for the United States. Everything that goes wrong with the social relations in the U.S. is the South. Oh, the South, they're reactionaries. Oh, the South this, the South that, the South another thing. The Southerners are all racist and so forth and so on. And this is when it's. I remember hearing that back in the '60s, back when I was a kid, during the Civil Rights era, and nobody gave any of the decent Southerners, which is of course the vast majority, any credit whatsoever. You get this Deliverance comes out. And we all learn that all Southerners have 6 fingers and IQs of 80.
Yeah,
it's
man,
totally absurd.
Can we play the banjo?
I don't have to tell you because you know it very well.
Yeah.
But that's the thing, and that's something that when you're writing about the South, the Southerners, Civil War, race, anything like that, it's something you got to avoid.
Yeah, there was somebody
you have to make an absolute effort to avoid it.
On the podcast, I think it was somebody was like, well, they're making some big point about how Americans approach wars and such, and America has never lost a war. really? And I was like,
Yeah.
yeah, we did. Maybe you didn't.
Yeah, that's right.
But we kind of lost one down south, so lost and won at the same time.
A few years ago. And Al Steele, he's another rep, and he was telling me how the Civil War that is taught in Southern schools is totally different than the Civil War that's taught in the rest of the country, and that's why. That's why, because the South lost. So the attitude, the viewpoint is going to be totally different naturally, and that's something that we have to understand. But what we're getting today with this, let's tear down the statues of all these slave owners, including the evil mastermind Robert E. Lee. What we're getting is this coming back again, this nonsensical scapegoating of an entire region.
Yeah. We got cut off by a thunderstorm that seemed to have passed through Pittsburgh, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's a third one in 3 days. That's what you call typical West PA summer.
I see. So, what I was going to ask you before we got cut off was, what kind of research did you do to portray these great historical personages? You and Bob did a great job with Lincoln, with Stanton, a harder thing to do perhaps. Lee, and a great portrait of Booth as well. I know you have a huge history background. Did you do anything particularly different or special for completing this book with Bob?
Not really. I really didn't have to. As you say, I've been working on military history for a quarter of a century, particularly with the International Military Encyclopedia. So I just basically knew most of the material. I did do a little bit of checking. I checked some of the Civil War sites on the net, which there is a plethora, and some of them are really excellent. And check back on that and some of the volumes I got covering the Civil War too, in order to get particular information on people. And I used to live on a street that was named after General Meigs, so that probably counts too.
Yeah. Well, what do you have any as somebody that has the history? Do you have any particular takes that would be a certain school of like thought about Lincoln or Lee?
Not really. Going back to the PC nonsense we've been seeing the last few months. The reincarnation of the monster Southerners who have to be kept in chains. The whole, I view them as Americans, and I view them as flip sides of the same question. People who were thrown into a very terrible situation and had to somehow work their way out. And they both did the best they could by their lights, but you can't judge them from the point of view of 160 odd years on that that they did this wrong, that wrong, and the other thing. They're both Americans, and that's the end of it. And I think that's basically what I'm trying to say with that ending. That's more or less a historical fantasy ending. That is something that I would really like to have seen. And of course, historically, it never happened. It couldn't have happened. But in a real way, it should have happened, and I think that would have accomplished a lot of healing that obviously to this day still hasn't been accomplished.
Yeah. And one of the fun things is Lincoln gets to revive some of his old wrestling skills. We won't say exactly why, but
that was one of the things I came across there were two items that I ran across historically that I no longer fit in. One, that Lincoln was the wrestling champion of Kentucky for a considerable period. He won something like 400 bouts, which is considering what frontier wrestling was like, the ear biting and eye gouging and that kind of stuff. That's saying something. That was one of them, and the other one was that Grant played Desdemona in a performance of Othello that was put on while Zachary Taylor's army was about to attack Mexico back during the Mexican War. I know this is very difficult to picture, but you have to understand that at the time Grant hadn't grown his beard yet.
Yeah.
So.
Well, he was.
those
I'm sure he was cherubic.
That I wanted to fit in.
He was a young cherubic Desdemona.
he did
taken in
have that
by...
kind of round face and the big baby blue eyes. So that it might have worked in the 1840s. It would not have worked in the 1860s or 70s. No question about that. It's a good thing he didn't take up a career as an actor or female impersonator. That's what I can say for Ulysses Grant.
Yeah, he did pretty well in that war, didn't he? I mean, it was only after that he got sidetracked with his father-in-law and such.
Yeah, he didn't have much of a judge of character. Considering the fact that he went in there, on his uppers, it's not really known exactly what he was doing. Some people say he was selling firewood out of the back of his wagon, and some people say he was working as a clerk in his father's store. Considering the fact that he came out of that into becoming one of the leading generals of American history, right up there with MacArthur and Patton and Winfield Scott, anybody. It's kind of amazing. It's really an American Horatio Alger story in the military sense. But after the war, he pretty much dumped John Rawlinson, who had been his right hand man in the during the Civil War, who had really looked out for his interest and really more or less was there whenever Grant whenever it became too much for Grant. And I kind of, well, granted he died after only a few years of tuberculosis, but I think without that influence, that really cost him when he became president, because of course he had all sorts of hustlers and hangers on bringing him down and in the end destroying his presidency. And that was kind of a sad thing a sad ending for a great man.
We get to see a different kind of ending to the Civil War with The Day After Gettysburg.
There is a nice little technical gimmick that I managed to slip in too. Something called the Ager gun, aka the coffee mill gun. A lot of people don't really understand that the first real rapid fire weapon was not the Gatling gun. There was one before that, and it was almost a success. And it's one of the great trivia points in history that I have run into, that the first machine gun ever bought by a government official was 10 Ager guns that was bought by none other than Abraham Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
First machine gun ever used in combat. I mean, is that cool or what?
Well, that's pretty cool. Where were they used in actuality?
Well, the problem was that the original design was bought by some hustler who made pretty badly constructed copies, and but a handful of them were used. And there was one cavalry raid carried out by Confederate forces across the Potomac, north of the city, north of Washington. They figured that they could get away with it because there were only a couple of groups of Union soldiers on the other side. But unfortunately, these two groups of Union soldiers were both armed with these Ager machine guns, and they managed to cut apart this Confederate unit. So if they'd had any idea what they had on their hands and what use they could be put to, which they do in Day After Gettysburg, then it could have been a battle changer. It really could have. Yeah,
it's like the first blow in the death of the cavalry soldier.
That's it. That's it. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
And one other thing you have in here is you have a really great sharpshooter character, Otto. What's his last name? He's German.
Otto Hahn. Yeah.
Yeah. And
that was one of Bob's. Yeah, that was one of Bob's ideas, and he works out real well because there's one point I wanted to make too, is that the U.S. was still an immigrant country. People were speaking in totally different languages. They were speaking in accents that were often incomprehensible, but they're all in the process of becoming Americans. This is something that Martin Scorsese dealt with kind of in Gangs in New York. And I kind of wanted to take a different tack and show how it was working. He was showing what happens when it didn't work. I wanted to show what happens when it worked, where Otto Hahn, this kid from Bavaria, shows up and becomes an American hero.
The book is The Day After Gettysburg by Robert Conroy and J.R. Dunn. Jeff, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Tommy. And thanks to Baen, as always.
This is another entry in Alliance of Equals, a Liaden Universe novel by Sharon Lee and Steve Miller. Beset by the angry remnants of the Department of the Interior, and challenged at every turn by opportunists on their new homeworld of Shurebleak, and low on funds, Clan Corval desperately needs to reestablish its position as one of the top trading clans in known space. To this end, Master Trader Sean Yoscalen and Corval's premier trade ship Dutiful Passage is on a mission to establish new business associations and to build a strong primary route that links well with existing loops and secondary routes. But reestablishing trade and preserving the lives of the few remaining members of the clan aren't all of Corval's problem. Matters come to a head as Dutiful Passage, accustomed to being welcomed and feted at those ports on its call list, finds itself denied docking and blacklisting while agents of the DOI mount armed attacks on others of Corval's traders under the very eyes of port security systems. Traveling with Dutiful Trader on this unsettling journey is Paddy Yoscalen, the master trader's heir and his apprentice. Paddy is eager to make up for time lost due to Corval's unpleasantness with the Department of the Interior, but she is also keeping a secret so intense that her coming of age and perhaps her very life is threatened by it. And here is the latest entry in Sharon Lee and Steve Miller's Alliance of Equals.
Chapter 5 Dutiful Passage. They would break out into regular space within the next ship half-day and begin Andiri approach, the passage sending information packets and news ahead. She would be on the trade bridge with Father, trading catalogs, questions, offers, invitations, news packets. The catalogs would be her priority. Father would answer queries and review the catalog entries that she marked for his interest, if any. Depending on the planet and the number of traders on planet seeking an early and advantageous connection, the double shift on the trade bridge might be either exhausting or boring. It would, in any case, be a double shift, and she ought really to be sleeping now, rather than studying. Paddy sighed and rubbed her eyes. She'd been diverting 2 hours of her sleep shift to study since the passage had departed Shurebleak, having long ago found that she didn't need much sleep. Not really. Not when there was so much work to do. Not when there was so much catching up to do. Father had said she would be running double time, in effect, taking 2 lines of training simultaneously, cabin boy and prentice trader. He'd told her, quite seriously, that even with the double-track training, she would very probably not meet her goal of achieving her trader's license on her 18th name day. He had been quite kind and laid the fault where it belonged, on the attentions of the stupid Department of the Interior, which had taken Corval so very much in dislike, and had therefore interrupted everyone's proper life course, and not on any deficiency she had displayed. He had said, too, that it was no shame to stand a full trader on one's 19th name day, which goal he was confident she could meet. She had chosen to, well, not discount his words, no. She had merely chosen to see them as a challenge. After all, it wasn't as if she had come to the passage with no training at all. She had served 2 trips as cabin boy on Pale Wing, one of Corval's first-tier trade ships, and would have transferred to the passage herself for the next long circuit, save that Plan B had been brought into effect at the most inconvenient moment conceivable, sending her, Quinn, Silvor, the twins, Grandfather Lucan, and Cousin Corrine scurrying to hide in Runig's Rock. There they had taken lessons of a very different order. In addition to their usual school fare, an accelerated piloting study, disappointingly on the Sims, while they had waited for word that Corval's enemy had been vanquished. In truth, their sojourn in the rock had not been so ill as it might have been, given close daily proximity to cousin Corinne, who was a stickler of the first water. Quinn had minded it, of course, in addition to being all a twitter over cousin Patrin, when, if he had only taken a moment to consider. But there, Quinn was made of nerves. She had known there was no reason to worry, though she did allow that she might have felt differently had it been her father who had failed to report in not once or twice, but at all. In any case, eventually they were called home. Or not precisely home, but to Shurebleak, a planet of which no one had ever heard, nor was that circumstance anything to wonder at once one actually saw the place. It had all been rather bewildering. Indeed, it was still unsettling to recall that Shurebleak was now the home port of Dutiful Passage and the seat of Clan Corval. Father and the Delm, including Uncle Valcon, who had been away for so very long with the scouts, now joyously returned to the clan and bringing to Corval a completely unexpected life-mate, who was forthwith revealed to be a Tiazan of Arab. So that was all right. Father and Priscilla, the Delms and cousin Patrin, all of them had been there, around Liad, when it had happened. All of them had taken a hand in the event. And they had explained very carefully and very thoroughly exactly what had happened, why, and what the stakes had been. Not only for Corval, but for all of Liad, and why they dared not fail, nor take half measures. Paddy understood the situation perfectly, though the Council of Clans had not, which had led to Corval's removal to Shurebleak in the Daelen sector. Father had explained, privately, to her and to Silvor, why Traiella Fantrol, Jos Gallen's own house, had to be razed, which had made her angry. Then she found that Jeeves had brought all of her things and had arranged her new suite in Jalaza Kazone, Corval's first and most ancient house, exactly as it had been in her own lost rooms. And perhaps she had, just a little, cried. Well, one could have accommodated even so much change in the service of destroying this department of the interior, so that it would do no more harm to Corval or to anyone else. But as it transpired, the department had not been destroyed. It had merely been wounded, though badly. Indeed, the department had been so grievously wounded that anyone might have thought they would withdraw from the field. Father told her that this had been expected. Only the department had not withdrawn. They had, unexpectedly and perhaps unwisely, after the most modest of pauses to rest and recruit themselves, increased hostilities. And that was why they, herself and the other youngers, and grandfather and cousin Corinne, had been removed from the clan's safe place at Runig's Rock. Not because their enemy had been utterly vanquished and their name ground into the dust, but because there was no certainty that the rock would not come under attack in the mad increase of hostility. One might have supposed from this that the Delm intended them to sit quietly under guard at Shurebleak, but no, that had not been the plan at all. Corval needed to establish itself upon its new homeworld. There were trade routes advantageous to ships based upon Shurebleak to be built, alliances to be redeemed, and lives to be lived. Corval had said Uncle Valcon in his Melanti as Delm. Corval is ill-suited to the role of mouse. We began as dragons, and as dragons we shall go on." Here he had sent a stern look to Father and added, quite unfairly, "Careful, dragons." Careful dragons meant that the passage herself would not take port at any of the worlds they called upon, but would rather remain in orbit while crew was given leave or went about the ship's port-side business in groups of no less than 3. Which was a circumstance, Paddy thought, stifling a yawn, not entirely convenient for one who would learn to trade, and for whom a solitary ramble around port might reveal treasures untold, or at least unanticipated wares which might be turned to profit. Behold, for instance, Anne Deary. She was already scheduled to go down in Father's group, and while she was not fool enough to think that a apprentice had nothing to learn from a master trader, her own attempts at trade could not but be influenced by his presence. He might hold himself back, but folk would see the big amethyst ring of a master trader, and they would bargain with him, no matter they spoke to the prentice. It was a vexing situation, and one that she had been considering since the schedule had arrived in her duty queue. She could hardly refuse the assignment. She didn't want to refuse the assignment. It was far more than an honor to watch Father at work. And he was going to be concentrating on artworks. Merely she wished to be certain it was her skill that carried her trade, rather than Father's ring. She had great hope for the Mylaster scheme, perhaps too much hope. The transaction had somehow acquired a weight in her mind, as if turning the Mylaster around at a handy profit would define her fitness for trade. Ridiculous. Well, she sighed again. Father was a healer, after all. Perhaps he could simply suggest to the breeze that he was a sack of potatoes, and thus be safely ignored. Her screen beeped, reminding her that she had been staring at the same page of text for 12 minutes, and without, she thought irritably, having read a word of it. She might as well have gone to bed if she was going to waste her study time in dreams and regrets. Irritably, she closed the text, promising herself that she would catch up her deficiency by studying tomorrow over breakfast. Well, no. She needed to review the tolerance tables over breakfast, so she would be ready for her shift with Cargo Master Ira Barty. Over lunch, but no, she would be on the trade bridge by then. Father had promised a cold tray at the console and a large bottle of tea. Oh, she would find time. Perhaps she would be less distracted next shift and be able to borrow another productive hour from her sleep schedule. For now, though, she'd best go to bed. "Hey, Haz." The voice was familiar, even welcome, but entirely out of place. Even so near a comrade as Tolly had become, he had no place by her birth. Indeed, should the elder find him, "Come on, Haz, rise and shine." Blades and blood. If he kept up in such a manner, he would see himself dead before this day was out, and by her hand before she obeyed the order to turn the weapon upon herself. She extended an arm, meaning to snatch and stifle him. Oof! Her elbow smacked into a barrier. Her hand smacked her nose hard enough to bring tears. "Yeah, sorry about that. We had to fold you up some to get you into the dock. Gonna take some unkinking to get you out." There was a pause. Be a lot easier if you'd open your eyes and get with the program. The pilot's gonna be needing me back at the board for breakout. And you don't want to be stuck in there now you're awake. You're awake, aren't you, Haz? 'Cause if not, maybe I should wait to thank you for saving my life. Recent memory came boiling back then. Tolly, the whistle, the woman striking him with the butt of her gun, opening a gash on his face, the kick of her weapon against her palm as she neutralized the threat to her partner. She opened her eyes. Tolly's face was above hers. Tan skin, freckles, even features that she had come to understand soothed Terrans and Liadens alike. His hair was an undistinguished yellow, and his eyes were blue, neither particularly dark nor noticeably pale. At the moment, they were squinted slightly, as if he were looking into a bright light, or straining to see something clearly at a distance. "You are yourself again?" she demanded. "You were not late for your ship?" But he had said something just now, had he not, about breakout and the pilot wanting him at his board? "I'm myself again, and I made my ship. All because of you," he said, giving her a grin. "Come on now, let's get you up on your feet." Some while later, unkinked, on her feet, and in the galley, second handwich half eaten, Haz considered what Tolly had told her. Wounded and in danger of her life, she had been brought aboard the ship that had contracted his services and placed in the auto dock. The pilot's mission was of some urgency. Tokal was reluctant to put her lift back, and also reluctant, so Tolly had it, to endanger one in the service of Clan Corval. Pilot Tokal had therefore contacted Captain Robertson herself and obtained her permission for Hasenthal's attachment to the mission. "How is it that the captain gave her permission so easily?" Hasenthal asked. Tolly was leaning against the counter, a mug in one hand, from which he occasionally sipped tea. "Pilot Tokal's known to Corval," Tolly said. "One of the first things the pilot said to me, once we got you situated, was that this ship doesn't count Corval as trouble." Hasenthal thought about that, around another bite of handwich. "I will make myself known to Pilot Tokal," she said eventually. "She is not among the lists of allies which I was given to learn. Also, I should report in Commander Lizardi." But given Tolly's recital of events, Commander Lizardi had likely struck Hasenthal nor Felium from the lists of port security several sure-bleak days ago. "Captain Robertson being aware of your situation, and ours, it wouldn't surprise me if she right away called Commander Liz and explained your leaving so sudden." The captain, of course, understood chain of command, Hasenthal thought, finishing the handwich and reaching for the mug of plain water. It had surely been Dunn, as Tolly said, and already someone else walking her beat, beside a partner who was not Tolly Jones. She finished the water, stood, and placed the mug into the washer, waiting a moment while Tolly dealt similarly with his mug. "I will," she said again, "make myself known to Pilot Tokal." "Sure thing," Tolly said. "You stay right here. I'll send her in."
That was another entry in the complete audiobook serialization of Alliance of Equals by Sharon Lee and Steve Miller. And that's it for the podcast. Thanks to Audible and to podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. And a 21-gun salute with those newfangled repeating rifle thingies, and a long drawn-out sigh of southern melodrama over the tragedy of the lost cause, together with a shipment of all the Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson statues, removed from the scraggly lawns of drug-ridden inner-city urban centers, to join his own gigantic bronze colossus of Ulysses S. Grant's horse Homer, for J.R. Dunn, co-author with the late great Robert Conroy of The Day After Gettysburg. Please join us next time here at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.